Hello, everyone. On behalf of GlobSec and the GlobSec Brussels office and Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, well, let me welcome you all for today's online session. We have excellent speakers with us today. From Washington, D.C., we have Yasha Mon. He is associate professor at the Johns Hopkins University and writing contributor to The Atlantic. He also runs his podcast, The Goodwill, which is a perfect place to go when you want to hear more about the COVID-19 and other democracy-related issues. From London, D.C., we have Angelos Chrysogelos. He is assistant professor at the London Metropolitan University and research associate at Martens Center and also at Chatham House. Welcome both.
Thank you.
My name is Kinga Brudzińska, and I'm today's host from GlobSec Policy Institute. Before we start, let me tell you a bit more about us, the organizers. GlobSec is a think tank based in Bratislava. We work on the broad range of issues, from defense and security, disinformation, and future of Europe. Since January 2020, we have also our office in Brussels, led by Alexandra Martin. Martens Center is the official think tank of EPP Group. They have a big network of members, more than 50 from Europe and beyond, including us, GlobSec. We have been cooperating together for more than 10 years now in different types of activities related to international politics, economy, and defense and security. Today we meet in a joint online event in the framework of Martens Center activities during the lockdown under campaign Stay Home, Stay Informed. #. Please use it today. At GlobSec, we have also similar initiative, and we call it GlobSec Goes Digital. #. Some housekeeping remarks. So this session is live streamed on Martens Center Facebook. In order to ask our speakers some questions, please post it there or on GlobSec's Twitter account. Our team will collect the questions and we will ask them consecutively to our speakers. Before I give a floor to our speakers, let me tell you what is our goal for today. So we will discuss today the COVID-19 pandemic and the future of liberal democracy. Some call this pandemic war, the others call it tsunami. However we call it, it causes casualties. And to what extent liberal democracy will be affected by this crisis? How the relationship between the governments and society will look like. Even before the crisis, democracy has eroded. According to Democracy Index collected by the Economist Intelligence Unit, 2019 was the worst average score for global democracy since 2006. What we can expect in the post-COVID-19 world. Are our democratic institutions ready to fit to digital age? To what extent our parliaments can work remotely? Will we trust them? If and how governments will use this pandemic to consolidate the power? I will stop here and I will give a floor to our speakers. Maybe I will start with Angelos. Please give us around 4 or 5 minutes remarks. Then we will follow with Yasha, and then we will have a second round of interventions as well. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Kinga, and many thanks to both the Martens Center and GlobSec for for putting this together. And of course, also my regards to Yasha. It's a great pleasure to be sharing a virtual panel or a virtual meeting in this way. It's a great honor. So I would just like to start by saying that, of course, this discussion here is very, very important, and it's very, very, I would say it's a necessary debate to have. I don't think there's ever a bad time to be having a debate about the future of liberal democracy. However, I would just like to kind of pull the brakes a little bit with regards to this debate, starting just by the very, very simple caveat that we are, I know it feels like a long time, but we're actually barely 2 months into this crisis, all right? So this is just so liberal democracy was not in a great shape beforehand. So obviously something of the magnitude of COVID-19 should be a problem for liberal democracy. But at the same time, I'm always thinking about the famous, it's actually more of a mythical, it didn't really happen, but the famous exchange between Richard Nixon and Zhou Enlai in China in the early 70s, when Nixon asked Zhou Enlai what he thought about the historical importance of the French Revolution, and Zhou Enlai said it's too early to tell. So, which I think it's there's an interesting Chinese twist here if we actually want to be talking about COVID-19. But so my first caveat is things can change a lot between now and September, between now and next year, probably between now and the next 5 years, all right? In that sense, what I would like to talk about more is about, which I think is a bit more secure, instead of just thinking about, speculating about the future. I think what we can think about is basically what was happening already beforehand, before COVID-19, that we can expect COVID-19 to actually make it go on further or accentuate it in the future, all right? So quite simply, where were we already, and where would those tendencies actually continue being strengthened by COVID-19? And I think here I see three main issues where I think, which do not really touch upon, or they touch peripherally on the question of liberal and illiberal democracy, but I think they're still quite interesting, quite important, and I think we have to take them into account when we think about the future of democracy. So the first trend that existed before COVID-19, and I think COVID-19 only strengthens, is the strength of the strong state, the trend of the strong security state, the trend of the strong surveillance state, all right? And I think this was a trend that existed already for 20 years ago in the aftermath of 9/11, which is moving from what we could describe a terrorism surveillance state to a pandemic surveillance state, all right? Now, what is interesting in this respect is that both of those kinds of state, the terrorism surveillance state and what now seems to be emerging, the pandemic surveillance state, are actually both of them quite popular. I was old enough, I was much younger and much healthier and much more enthusiastic 20 years ago, but I still remember that everybody kind of accepted that there have to be limits into our civil liberties the moment 9/11 happened, all right? I mean, it was a pretty much untold, it was a silent bargain between governments and citizens. And I also remember that back in the day, nobody actually reflected upon the fact that the emergence of the terrorism surveillance state, nobody framed it in terms of liberal or illiberal democracy. It was self-evident that even social liberal leaders, even like Tony Blair or even Barack Obama, who inherited a vast national apparatus regime but did not dismantle it, obviously, they're just going to operate this kind of surveillance, state. So now we know, of course, after WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, that whether even when you have the most staunch liberals, the most staunch social liberals, even center-left, the progressive leaders running a vast surveillance state, abuses are inevitable, all right? Because they're kind of built into the way the system works. And as we're moving into a system where people will be screened at airports probably, where people will basically have to be wearing bracelets. Liechtenstein already started it today, but obviously it's a very small country, but we may see that being phased out more in the future. Then the question is, even if when you have a very good, well-minded liberal government and liberal leader, this is in itself a bit problematic, all right? So I think this is the first tendency, the tendency of the strong, all-powerful surveillance state. The second trend that I think already existed before, and I'm going to see it more, ranging more, is the increasing role of the state in the economy. And speaking as a research associate of the Martin Center here, so if I'm putting my center-right hat on, this is a big challenge for the European center-right. We see that actually the Anglo-Saxon center-right, both Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, have proven much more voluntaristic with regards of using the state power, to regulate the economy, particularly towards more protectionist means. We see now that COVID actually puts more demands on the question of protectionism. When you have competition over equipment, perhaps a year from now, we're going to have vast competition between countries over vaccines. That means that, again, many of the liberal assumptions, the economic liberal assumptions that underpin the functioning of liberal democracy are coming under challenge. And finally, the third point, I'm going to close here to give the floor to Jascha. The third point that I think existed already before, and here I think that COVID actually poses more of a break rather than continuity, is the role of technology. Just barely 2 months ago, we were discussing about technology and big tech. We discussed about the challenges that big tech pose to democracy, the role of Facebook, the role of fake news, the role of disinformation, the fact that big tech companies were very difficult to regulate, the use of our personal data, our personal information, the fact that they could avoid taxation and all of those things, right? Now, to fast forward 2 months later, we all realize that we actually rely on Amazon for our daily lives because we cannot go out, right? Very soon, we will realize that we need the infrastructure of those big tech companies if we are going to monitor, for example, the movements of people who have the virus or who have immunity to the virus. All right, this big debate about technological tracking that we see happening also in places like Korea and Singapore. So whereas 2 months ago, you had politicians of the ascendancy like Elizabeth Warren and Margrethe Vestager, who actually were very much at the forefront of the idea that you have to regulate big tech. Now we're at a point where I think big tech will have much more leverage in the new bargain that it has to strike with states with regards to surveillance and how democracy works. And here I think COVID actually puts a break. States will again want to use and harness and regulate technology, but now the terms of the debate will be quite different. Again, for Europe, this is an important debate because, for example, in Europe, we worry too much about data privacy. I think in a few months, the debate will have shifted significantly, and again, the repercussions for democracy will be quite important. I end here. I'm going to give the floor back to Kinga for the next round.
Thank you very much, Angelos. Thank you very much also for drafting those three trends. So I draw from what you said that it's too early to tell. Let's don't draw the conclusion slide now, but we should expect more states in our daily life. Jascha, you currently wrote an interesting article in The Atlantic about the 6 classic moves of the authoritarian populists. I know also that you are upset how the crisis has been handled in the United States. We would like to hear now from you your thoughts. How do you see it from America?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, first, I think that Angelo's opening remarks were excellent and covered a lot of ground. So I'm going to try and focus on some of the areas that he didn't cover. I share some of his disquiet about jumping too quickly into this debate about the future of liberal democracy right now, in part because, as he says, I think it's very difficult to foresee. And one of the things that I found striking in the last weeks is that people who have had the same diagnosis of the world's problems and the same suggested solutions of the world's problems for the last 30, 40, or in some cases 50 years, look at a crisis they neither foresaw nor entirely understand, and suggest that the solutions are, of course, the ones we've been pushing for the last 30 to 50 years. And I don't think that that's taking seriously how novel the situation is and how difficult it is to think through what's going to happen after. The second element of that is a more normative element, which is that there's all kinds of things that I've cared about very strongly for the last 10 or 15 years that I still care about, that I still think are very important. But the most important question at the moment is how we get through this crisis without millions of people dying unnecessarily, without permanently ruining our economy. And I think if people, for example, push for, in the United States, what the implications of this crisis are for the American healthcare system, that's an important debate. But we care about the American healthcare system because the inability of certain people to access it is costing lives. And so if our reason to care about this is saving lives, then our primary concern right now has to be saving lives among the most deadly pandemic the world has likely experienced in the last 100 years. So that's just by way of a preliminary about why I too share some misgivings about jumping too quickly into this topic. But of course, it is an important topic. And of course, we still do care about the future of liberal democracy in this moment. So what will this crisis do to the future of liberal democracy? Well, like Angelos, I think that there's a certain set of long-standing trends that might now be accelerated. And they don't all go in the same direction. I think the two most important are, first of all, that this has the potential to cement a kind of right-wing populist view of the world. If I had to make up a global event that confirms the view that people like Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro have of the world better than COVID-19 a few months ago, I would have struggled, right? I mean, they've been saying for years, and I don't believe that then, I don't believe it now, they've been saying for years that the world is a very dangerous place, that globalization is bad for us, that the movement of people poses unrecognized risks to their populations, that decoupling from the world, closing down borders is a solution to that. It's very easy to spin the current situation as confirming that narrative, even though I don't think that's entirely right. So they now have an opportunity to seize upon this moment in order to, bring the world closer to what they have wanted for a long time. At the same time, I also think that on the reverse side, this confirms a narrative that I think is rather more accurate of the failings of populism and populist leaders around the world. For the last 3 or 4 years, critics of populism like me have been arguing that we will ultimately pay a very heavy price for the core element of populism, which is to say a mistrust of independent institutions, a mistrust of the rule of law, a mistrust of experts, transformation of the state into a clientelist organization in which the heads of important institutions are political allies or friends rather than qualified people. And that narrative has mostly fallen on deaf ears because it turns out that in good times, states can work relatively effectively, even when they are being undermined in this way. Because the state is a complicated machinery and it has a lot of experience and sort of keep running, even if its leaders are malicious or incompetent. When a crisis hits, that's very different. Because in a crisis, it's not enough for the state to simply keep sputtering along, with more and more problems, but it sort of keeps going. You actually need to have a rational response, a rational reorientation of how the state works. And we're seeing in countries from the United States to Brazil to Mexico how hard that is for these populist leaders. And as a result, I fear that we're going to have to complain about a lot of excess deaths, a lot of excess suffering, and probably a lot of excess economic damage in those countries. So that's a counter trend. That's a trend that goes in the other direction. It might make it easier for critics of populism to make themselves understood and to make people see the dangers. So I actually think, looking at the United States, that the likelihood of a victory by Joe Biden, and particularly the likelihood of a real landslide by Joe Biden, has gone up significantly over the last few weeks. Now, I do want to say one last thing, which is that those countries in which populists are most likely to be able to use this moment in order to undermine democracy altogether are not the countries where populism is in its early stages, as it is in the United States or in Brazil, but those in which populists already had relatively effective control of a state. And I think the most obvious case of that is Hungary, which had been veering away from liberal democracy for a long time. and in which Viktor Orban has now done three things which run counter to the minimal conditions of what we should demand of the public response in the time of Corona. So I think Angelos very nicely emphasized the tension between some of our civil liberties and the kinds of steps that will now be taken. And I think there's a lot of difficult trade-offs there that are not easy to answer. To what extent are we willing to allow electronic surveillance of the movement of people who may have been infected by Corona in order to avoid a lot of excess deaths? I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I don't want to be glib about it. But I do think that there's three minimal conditions that every democratic government should adhere to in response to Corona. The first of these is that all measures that these governments take have to be strictly temporary. That is to say that they are in place for 2 or 3 months and they lapse automatically. And if there is a need to extend them, then they need to be proactively renewed. They cannot be indefinite. The second is that they have to be under democratic and, where appropriate, judicial control. We cannot give a single individual the right to extend those measures indefinitely. They have to be re-legitimized by parliaments, and where appropriate, there has to be a way for citizens to get redress through the normal process of the courts when they feel unfairly punished or treated under some of those regulations. And the third is that all of the measures that governments take have to be strictly tailored, narrowly tailored towards actually combating the pandemic and saving lives. This cannot serve as an excuse for governments to get through all kinds of things they wanted to do anyway. What the Hungarian government has done violates all three of those basic conditions. The powers that Viktor Orban has concentrated in his hands are indefinite. They do not stand under democratic control. And they include things like being able to lock people up for stating quote unquote false rumors on social media, which are not directly required in order to beat this pandemic. And so that both shows the danger that populists who are already on the way towards undermining liberal democracy will now turn themselves into outright dictators. And since this event is generously co-sponsored by the Martin Center, it would be amiss not to point out that it also reveals a deep problem of liberal democracy in the context of the European Union, which is that perhaps the biggest long-term threat to the European Union and its legitimacy is the arrival of these dictatorships in its midst. It's one thing to explain to citizens in Greece or France or Denmark that they have to share their sovereignty with each other in order to solve certain global problems, certain problems that the nation states can't tackle on their own, and that's perfectly fine and reasonable, and a lot of citizens understand and agree with that. It is going to be a lot harder to convince those citizens to share their sovereignty with what is now effectively a dictator in Budapest. And that only makes it all more shameful. But the party of that dictator, Fidesz, is still a member of a European People's Party. I have to say that everybody who is tolerating this is complicit with the rise of dictatorship in the midst of Europe, and they should all be ashamed of themselves.
Thank you very much, Jascha, for drawing this picture. It reminds me when we talk about the temporary controls as well, how and if they will be lifted after some time. It reminds me also about the discussion about the borders. Borders were closed, or some measures were put, and this action was in Europe not coordinated. And I think everyone is aware of the so-called false start of the EU of tackling the pandemic. Some states, like where I am based in Slovakia, took quite early the measures. It was also related to the fact that actually many citizens, it's coincided with the winter holiday, and many people went to Italy for skiing. So there was a huge danger that they brought the virus. But I think it also reflects as you pointed out, the question of the solidarity and how it will have a huge impact on the future of Europe, and how now both the institutions and the member states will help each other and tackle it. I will now turn for the second round of intervention and go back to Angelos. You pointed out that it's important to think what were the threats to democracy before the crisis. So according to the study that I quoted at the very beginning, and also the research conducted among the citizens around the world, there is still a huge disconnections between the high levels of public support for democracy and also very deep popular disappointment with the functioning of democracy and the system of political representations. So while in the developed countries, we saw the populist movements. In developing world, we saw a lot of manifestation and actually popular protests and manifestations. I would be interested in hearing your views on this and how this can change, given that restrictions and the fact that people cannot go now to the streets and express their dissatisfaction. How citizens will be willing to take the measures, and how do you think they will express their dissatisfaction?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question, and as Yasha pointed as well, these are all kinds of unpleasant dilemmas that are putting forward of liberal democracy. That the point with COVID, a crisis like COVID, is that, and actually drawing back to my analogy with terrorism in the early 2000s, is that terrorism posed a lot of difficult questions that, however, could be resolved often in unpleasant ways, but behind the scenes. It didn't really challenge the ability of countries to hold elections. It really challenged the ability of countries to allow protests in the street. I mean, obviously, there were many more cameras around, in a city like London or New York, for example, or police had more powers of detention or whatever, or more access to data or whatever. But, it was never in question that the 2004 election would take place in America, right? I'm perhaps Yasha can explain to us later on, he's probably familiar. Personally, I find it really difficult to see, I don't mean it in any malign way, but I really don't see how the election in the United States, for example, in 2002 is going to be normal under any circumstances. I mean, even the most basic things, having some rallies of the candidates, shaking hands with people, like the nice color, the nice feel that gives kind of liberal democracy its popular touch that allows it to be as popular as you mentioned. However, if I may, I would like to go back to something that Yasha said, which is, I think, a very important metric when we discuss about ultimately the success or failure of countries in dealing with COVID. And that's the point of excess deaths, right? So this idea that how much more disaster has COVID brought to people, to humans, over what would normally be the normal rate of deaths. And here I must say that what I see, at least, and again, with a caveat that we're only a few months into this crisis, things can change a lot, so if anyone is recording this, please, note that I'm certain I will be wrong a year from now, probably. But what I see here, I'm not really sure I see a liberal, illiberal, authoritarian divide in how the crisis has been handled. What I see is basically a Western Asian divide in how things have been handled. And frankly, I see both democratic, liberal, illiberal, semi-authoritarian countries on either side of the divide doing quite well in Asia. And frankly, we have really messed up in the Western world because we were really, really late in dealing with this problem. I don't know what the issue is with Trump, the United States. I'm sure he's not a helpful factor in how the crisis is handled. But neither Pedro Sanchez in Spain, nor Emmanuel Macron in France, probably not even the government of Belgium right now, could be considered illiberal or authoritarian. Yet they are countries that have not really done very well in managing excess deaths. On the other hand, if you see at Asia, you see both democratic countries like South Korea and Taiwan, or semi-authoritarian systems, hybrid systems like Singapore, or liberal democracies like Japan, and of course China, which is fully authoritarian. They just have more experience in dealing with this problem there. So before going into the authoritarian, the liberal illiberal divide, and going also to Kinga's problem, which is about borders. Trump actually was the first major Western leader to shut down flights to officially close borders. Now, of course, Trump did this in his traditional, in his bravado. And of course, I know there is a difference between temporarily halting flights in the name of public safety versus weaponizing a pandemic in order to validate your vision of closed borders and nativist sovereignty, right? I get that. However, when Trump first closed borders, there was this big reaction against him, as in he was just the beginnings of a coup. Governor Cuomo in New York, or still in early March, was actually saying that we shouldn't be dramatizing things again. We shouldn't be dramatizing our reactions to COVID, probably because he thought that, again, over-dramatizing our reactions to COVID might play into the hands of authoritarians. But ultimately, we have to know that, especially in the early stages of a pandemic, what counts is taking effective steps towards dealing with these issues. And here, whether you're a populist like Trump, or whether you're a nice center-left social liberal like Pedro Sanchez in Spain, or most European leaders, we have more or less messed up. There's a major lesson here to be learned from the West, and without jettisoning all that is good about globalization, there is something to be said here about what kind of world are we moving into, where we actually have to be a bit more critical towards things that we have considered as supreme values, but ultimately we have to think of them as tools that may be good under certain circumstances, but may have to be reined in under other circumstances, such as endless mobility, traveling, open borders. These are things that we have to problematize, if anything, not to allow the debate to be completely taken over by nativist populists, like Yasha said. One final point before I yield the floor again. This is not. Our talk is not supposed to relitigate the question of Viktor Orban in the EPP. I think it's just only for journalistic accuracy to mention that Fidesz is suspended by the EPP currently, that there have been many, many problems with issues of rule of law in countries of the EU that are actually run by political parties that belong to other party families. I'm not going to say that the EPP should win stripes for how it has handled the issue. However, I also think that this fixation on the EPP highlights something that is a much bigger problem, which I think the EPP should take its fair share of blame for, as well as all other major political forces. And the problem is that, unfortunately, the EU is very, very good at punishing and regulating economic transgressions, but it is much, much weaker in punishing political transgressions. I am Greek, and I can tell you that between the first stages of what Viktor Orban did in Hungary was in 2010 and between 2010 and 2015. The major political issue that the EU considered the major threat to its future back then was whether Athenian pharmacies would stay open on Sunday, what would be VAT in Greek salad served in Greek restaurants, taxation of Greek lorry and Greek taxi drivers, all the issues, because apparently all of those things would threaten the Eurozone. Yet a lot of other transgressions that took place, not only in Hungary, but also in other countries in Europe at the time, concerning corruption and rule of law problems such as Slovakia, went unnoticed. I think for Europe, it is very, very important to think what it stands for. And for too long, Europe considered that political liberalism was a given, and the best proxy of what European values stand for is economic openness and economic responsibility. Now, while those things are necessary, they are not everything. And I think the example of the last 10 years and where we are today has shown that one is far more dangerous than the other. And unfortunately, the focus of the EU as a whole, because there were also socialist and liberal leaders who were sharing their chairs with Viktor Orban in the European Council, making deals with him over the last 10 years, the performance of the EU as a whole has been problematic. So my point is, you can talk about the EPP as you want, but I'm really worried that the focus on the EPP hides the fact that there's a major systemic problem in the EU, which is that there is something about European integration that allows backsliding from liberal democracy once you are inside the EU, regardless of which political family you belong to. And that's a debate that the EU has to have amongst itself beyond just throwing everything on the backyard of specific partisan labels. So I yield the floor now to Kinga.
Yeah, look, I agree with some of what you just said. This is clearly a much larger problem that goes beyond the EPP and which goes beyond the case of Hungary. I'm quite convinced by the argument that political scientist Dan Kellerman has recently been making, arguing that in a way, membership in the European Union was meant to protect countries from democratic backsliding, but it might actually make it easier for them to backslide. One, because it gives funds that people like Viktor Orban can then distribute to their allies and friends within the country, therefore deepening their rule. And B, because there isn't any effective mechanisms for punishing or expelling members of the European Union that clearly don't live up to democratic values anymore. If this event was co-sponsored by a social democratic think tank, I would be very happy to point out the fact that, for example, it has a Romanian affiliate in its European faction, which is deeply troubling from a rule of law point of view as well. But as it happens, this is co-sponsored by an EPP think tank, so I think it's appropriate for me to point out to that. And I also don't want to go too far in the whataboutism. I mean, for all of the problems of rule of law that we now have, unfortunately, in a great number of member states of the European Union, Hungary is at the extreme end of it, and Viktor Orban has been at the vanguard of it. And the sort of pretend suspension of Fidesz within the EPP, which effectively still allows Fidesz members to sit with their EPP colleagues, vote with their EPP colleagues, and to wield influence in all of those ways, is very generously described as a shameful instance of far too little, far too late. Now, to the larger question, I think it's really too early to tell sort of how democracy comes out versus dictatorship in this crisis, and even how different democracies come out within it. I would say a couple of observations. First is that it does seem to me like dictatorships on the whole are mismanaging the crisis. So when you look at countries from Iran to Russia to Belarus, there are many, many dictatorships in which the problem is being completely denied by the leadership and no effective measures are being taken at all. The case of China is complicated since it is obviously in some ways one of the most impressive dictatorships, one of the dictatorships in the world with the most state capacity. But the more we learn about the origin of the crisis, the more we also find out about how censorship, suppression of scientists, and so on has actually allowed it to become the deep problem it now is the world over. So I do think that in the long run, we will see dictatorships as having performed worse than other forms of rule. Now, the second point, I think, is that all forms of government at the national and at the international level have been unequal to this crisis in a way that's perhaps unsurprising, since the last time that we had a comparable pandemic is over a century ago. But it is deeply shameful for institutions from the WHO to the nation states within Europe, to the United States, just how poorly this pandemic has been managed and how long it has taken politicians and journalists in the early days to understand the radical steps that were necessary. I wrote a piece called Cancel Everything, which went very viral in the United States in early March. At that time, people were still telling me that I was crazy. And within a few days, within a week, that advice had basically been adopted. If politicians had had the foresight to look at the numbers, to look at the obvious facts, to look at what epidemiologists were saying at the time, because I was just channeling the consensus of experts in the field at the time, and they had shut down life a week earlier, we would likely be able to come out of this much more readily with fewer deaths, with less damage to the economy. So you're absolutely right that everybody has failed this test to some extent. Now, I do think that there is a gradation between the extent of failure. I do think that there are countries like Germany and France perhaps to a lesser extent, even like Italy or Spain, that slept at the wheel at the beginning, whose leaders still have to answer for a lot of unnecessary suffering, but that once they recognize the nature of a problem, the extent and the dimension of a problem, they were able to have relatively unifying leaders with a relatively clear line and a relatively effective response towards ramping up testing, quarantining sick people, and all the other measures that are necessary. And then I think you have a more extreme case, which comprises mostly populists, not only populists when you look at this, but mostly populists. Not all populists, but a lot of populists, who have just consistently proven unwilling to understand the problem, to unify their countries, and to implement an effective response, even once the facts were very, very evident and had been evident for many. So when you look at the United States and Brazil, but also at left-wing populists like AMLO in Mexico, I think that's a very clear case of that. And so hence my speculation, and it's early days for it, but my speculation that many of them will pay a high price. And in fact, when you look at the rallying towards government that's happened in practically every country so far, there's going to be a temporary effect. Ultimately, people will get very angry at the deaths, at the economic suffering. But for now, there's a rallying around the flag effect in which governments are very popular. The ones that have gained the most tend to be relatively sober, moderate governments, whether it's on the center-left or the center-right. In Germany, in France, in Spain, I'm thinking of some of the center-right ones. There's a number of them. I'm not thinking of them
Greece.
Right now. In Greece, that's a very good case, yes. And by the way, the Greek Prime Minister has been very clear about Fidesz in a way I appreciate. So there are those cases. When you look at the ones who have barely gained in public approval or not gained public approval at all, they are Jair Bolsonaro, they are Donald Trump. So I think there is some early indication that they may end up paying a heavy price for their incompetence.
Thank you very much, Jascha. I wanted to move now to external factors that are impacting the liberal democracies. I have to say that at the very beginning of the crisis, I thought that it would be more battle about who tackles better the pandemic. China was trying to. China had a strong campaign in Europe, trying to show that this is the China who helps the governments to deal with crisis, especially in Italy, and not the EU. It turned out not to be a case. Rather, now we see that both the EU and member states, they showed in practice and that they are the ones helping them, and including in Spain, when China sent some tests, it turned out that they were just not properly made, and they were not showing properly the level or if it was a positive or not. So all this small problems caused that, China did not win this battle. Maybe they tackled the pandemic at the very beginning, but also always the question comes back: why the fact that the virus was already in China in mid-November was not given to the international public earlier on? So I think it will pay a cost. I think now a little bit this debate has changed, and countries focus more on tackling the crisis as well. So I don't see that much the battle between how the authoritarian regimes handle the crisis and versus democracies. But before, if you can then refer to this in kind of geopolitics as well in your interventions. But we had two very interesting questions from the audience, and they both actually referred to transparency and the big government. So one of the question was also from the Roland Freudenstein, the director of research director of the Martin Center, asking if you see any new middle ground on the big governments, and how do you think it will evolve? Maybe Angelos, if you could take now. We have 15 minutes late, so if we can have another round of questions from the public, it would be great.
Yeah, I want to refer a bit to the question, to the geopolitics of the whole issue, which is quite interesting, and especially since yesterday we had the announcement by Donald Trump that he's suspending the financing of the U.S. financing of funding of the WHO, which I think basically it's the kind of move that, just like one of his hotels has Trump written all over it, right? I mean, it's just like classical, typical, like this just embodies everything about Trump. It embodies.
And apparently the checks that Americans are going to receive from the government have Trump's name
exactly,
written
of course,
on them.
Of course. I'm sure it's going to be actually physical, like $20 note with his face on it at some point. But the point is that there is, however, an issue here. And there is also something else that is constant about the Trumpian cycle of outrage. And that is that I think the worst service that Trump does is that he, by himself, delegitimizes and wastes many really existing issues that he has his pulse on. So Yasha mentioned the WHO, and of course yesterday, sure enough, you had Jose Borrell, who is the head of the EU diplomacy, and I think also the foreign minister of Germany, who immediately rushed to tweet their support for the WHO. I'm sorry, but I think that if we exit out of this crisis without the basic lesson that things like the WHO need severe rethink and reform, then we have wasted the crisis, all right? Trump should not be an excuse to defend institutions for the sake of institutions. Same with the United Nations Security Council, same with the United Nations Human Rights Council, all right? There is, I think, on the one hand, a view of the West in clearly nativist, nationalistic, and even frankly racist terms, which is what people like Trump or people around Trump are doing. All right, this is clearly a divisive view of the world. But condemning this view of the world does not mean that another major contradiction goes away, which is that there are people, particularly in Western countries, who are defending tooth and nail institutions that are clearly not calling them actually part of the liberal international open order, that are actually populated and to a very large extent nowadays influenced by illiberal or authoritarian or totalitarian actors, be it Saudi Arabia in the United Nations in the Human Rights Council, or Russia and China in the United Nations Security Council, or China now, so that obviously has a major leverage on the WHO. How can we consider an organization managing global health whose member is China, but whose member is not Taiwan, actually a representative, useful institution in how you manage this thing? But which I'm not going to defend Trump's folly of defunding an organization of global health in the midst of a global health pandemic. That is not the point. But the question is, what kind of liberal international order do we want moving forward? And I'm worried that the polarization, the counter-polarization against the nativist view of somebody like Trump, which is a defense of institutions, even institutions that are actually, to a very large extent nowadays, influenced by non-Western, non-liberal authoritarian actors, in my view, is quite problematic. And this, of course, you have all this whole debate about China's COVID diplomacy, sending over supplies, and the rest of it. So I think a major issue moving forward is rethinking the international institutional order. And here the West has a problem, because this international institutional order is to a large extent created by the West. It is to a large extent, and therefore for the long time the West considered it its gain and considered a victory when non-Western actors like China entered those institutions. Therefore we thought that they would be domesticated by them. But now, do those institutions work the way they were designed, or the way they used to, or the way we want them to? That is a major question. And I don't think that we should allow, also what Yash said, looking forward to a Joe Biden presidency, it should not be a return to normal. It should not be a return to the status quo ante. Really bad answers have been given over the last 4 years by actors like Trump, but also some right questions have been asked. And this is something that we should keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, one of the least fortunate positions to be in when you're in a debate is when somebody says that they're on your side, but they're making your argument in the worst possible way. And I think, on the few issues on which Trump is right, which is to say on the few issues in which Trump has expresses criticisms of institutions that really are failing more bluntly than others are willing to do, that's very much the case. Defunding the WHO situation is utter stupidity and lunacy. The way in which he criticizes the WHO actually misses some of the most legitimate criticisms. But none of that means that the WHO is a functional institution, or none of that means that it hasn't, in fact, been shown to have deep, deep flaws in these past few months. So I agree with that. I think more broadly, Angelos was speaking at the very beginning of our conversation about this reinforcing pre-existing trends. I think when it comes to China, this crisis both helps China's arrival at the forefront of the international stage, both because the global event of 2020 and the global event perhaps so far of the 21st century has originated in China, but also because China, in a way that is actually kind of without precedent, is trying to use this as a tool of soft power by sending its doctors, by sending its masks, by sending its protective equipment to countries around the world. And so I think it helps to mark China's arrival as a major player on the world stage. Now, I think that being a major player on the world stage comes with benefits and comes with costs, as the United States very well knows from its dominant position over the last 70 or so years, which is to say that being able to send doctors and protective equipment to countries in a moment of crisis buys you friends, it buys you soft power, it buys you influence. But having so much power and influence also comes with a lot of scrutiny and with a lot of enmity, with people who resent the power you hold, the influence you hold. And as a newman US citizen, I'm certainly critical of some of the ways in which America has used that influence and that power and that those ways of shaping other countries over the last 70 years. I think in many cases we've done that irresponsibly or poorly. But I think for a country with the extent of power the United States has had, we have actually by and large done it with good intentions and with a on balance positive impact on the world. I think China will now find that scrutiny may attract a lot of hatred, and if it doesn't live up to those same standards, if it turns out that it is not willing to actually be altruistic, at least for periods, be a true friend and partner to other countries, it will find itself at the center of sometimes deserved and sometimes not deserved mistrust and hatred in the way in which the United States has been used to with forms of anti-Americanism for a very long time. So I think that's an important transformation of geopolitics. China's arrival on the world stage as an agent with real soft power, but also as an object of fears, both rational and irrational.
Thank you very much. Actually, when you spoke about multilateralism, there were two questions from the audience. So you partly answered them, but there is also a remark that it's not only, if we talk about the multilateralism, it's not only about increasing the gap or inequalities between countries, but it's also about deepening the distances of minds and collaboration. What is your what is your opinion about the bigger problem of multilateralism and its future? And please, also we have 6 minutes left. So maybe please try to wrap up. I would, if you could think also about one trend that you would like the audience to stay with when it comes to the future of liberal democracy. People were now thinking very hard on how the world would look like. So the three trends that were identified, it's deglobalization, the infusion of the data-enabled services into ever more aspects of our life. We are experiencing it. And then consolidation of power, not only of some governments, but also in hands of big corporations that are now gaining in this crisis. So if it were about democracy, what the trend would be? So for final remarks, I will ask Angelos now.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to think about. Honestly, I had only thought my remarks in terms of, again, thinking about the past in the future. So I actually wasn't prepared at all to think to just be a futurologist here. But one term, as I speak right now, one term that came to mind, and I don't remember who coined it. Yasha, you may be able to help me, is the notion of audience democracy. I'm not sure. I don't remember who was the political scientist who coined it. I read it in some of the work of Peter Mayer, but it was I know that he referred to someone else. But the idea of audience democracy, which of course again is also a trend that has been identified since the 1980s or the 1990s. The idea that we are, we are not really mobilized in politics. We think we are mobilized in politics because we watch TV or we engage in social media, but we're not really mobilized. We're an audience, all right? Politics is becoming increasingly performative. And by the way, this is a trend that has existed way before people started talking about populism and illiberalism. So again, it is probably a structural issue of democracy that predates, it probably has brought about the success of populism rather than the other way around. But I mean, what better time than today to actually think about the term of audience democracy? How else are we going to be able to run elections at least in the next 6 months, if not through audience, if not through, and of course, and also this isn't an easy question. Yesterday, I think the Polish government, again, a government that has created many concerns about, the Polish government was accused of insisting of holding the presidential election in May. Only yesterday, it seems to have relented. I think I read in the news, don't quote me, but I think I read it correctly, that they now have changed tack and they have decided to actually suspend the elections for 2 years, which means that the current incumbent of the Polish president, who belongs to the Law and Justice Party, will stay in power for 2 more years. Now the question is, which of the two is more dangerous for democracy? Is holding an election when conditions are not right, is this good for democracy? Can we really have an election where 50 or 60% of the people will not be able to leave their homes? Physically will not be able to leave their homes? Is it really democracy if everyone votes by postal vote? If you actually take the physical aspect of democracy, of walking to the polling booth, of attending rallies, is this really democracy? Or is it actually the responsible thing to do to actually not hold elections? In London right now, the term of the mayor of London has also been extended for a year, or I don't know for how much, because there's not going to be local elections this year. Is this good if we just also suspend democracy? But is audience democracy also the answer to keep some semblance of democracy moving forward? I am very concerned, not so much like Yasha, about literally liberal democracy institutionally eroding. I'm really concerned about, even in the places where liberal democracy formally survives, that it loses its content, that it really, really becomes a Netflix show that all of us can only really attend by distance because we're not able to leave our homes. I think that that's not a danger that we should be diminishing, even in places that remain formally liberal democracies. Thank you so much.
Well, very briefly, because we're coming to the end of our time. I think it's very hard to think through precedents to this moment because it is an unprecedented moment in our living memory. One of the events that Angelos drew on earlier as a comparison is 9/11, and I think that is obvious. It is one of the closer comparisons we have, even though it's not a perfect one. And at the time, people predicted vast changes in every area. And we predicted, by the way, that the security state was going to completely sweep aside democracies in a way that it hasn't. Despite all of the problems of a security state, it has not destroyed democracy in countries like Britain or the United States. And so I think it's worth looking at what the actual changes in 9/11 have been. And they've been very extreme in a couple of areas, but quite mild in a lot of areas. And I wonder whether the same is going to happen with COVID-19, which is to say that hopefully our public health systems will change, hopefully the WHO will change. It may become normal to see masks in the streets of European and North American countries. It may become normal to have temperature checks at airports. All of those would be very significant changes, but ones within a relatively narrow band of things. I think a lot of other areas will change less than people think. And the trend that has shaped the world for the last 30 years is globalization. I don't think this will put a halt to globalization. I think it may temporarily halt travel, as it already has. It may convince national governments of a need to be able to produce basic goods within their own countries. But I don't think that 5 or 10 years from now, people will be traveling less. I don't think that 5 or 10 years from now, there will be less cross-border trade of goods and services. And given that globalization has, in fact, helped lift billions of people out of poverty around the world for the last 20 years, I hope that this won't change. So my trend is one that's been existing for a long time, that a lot of people are saying is coming to an end now. I think it'll continue to shape the next decades the way it has shaped the last decades, and on the whole, that's it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So, from before we finish, I will tell you what I take from this session. So it's too early to tell what is going to happen, but don't panic. The comparable moment in the history to what we are living now was the terrorist attack in New York City, and then it did not, the way how the states reacted did not had a bigger impact on our democracy and the way we live. Then on 3 points, I really like what Yasha also said at the very beginning about the measures in the time of pandemic. It is important to remember that they have to be temporary, that they have to be under democratic and judicial control, and they have to be narrowly tailored down to each and every state, because the conditions and the situation changes very quickly, and we cannot have one size that would fit all our democracies. So what I take as well, it's not a very pessimistic, actually, in this difficult times picture for a future of liberal democracy. As we said, we should also not expect deglobalization. World is connected, and let's wait and see, but don't panic for now. Thank you very much for your time. I would ask our audience normally for the round of applause. I cannot do it now, but thank you very much on behalf of the organizer for participating in this session. Yeah, and stay healthy and safe.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.